You're going to be just right here. Yeah. Hello, it's on.
Hi.
Hi, that's close enough. Yeah, yeah, close. All right. We're going to start in a second. Feel free to switch the topic. Ask to turn it around on me. Ask a question, interrupt, whatever you want.
Perfect.
Okay, this is not working too well. I'm not sure. Let me get this.
It's been a really great tech evening for a tech event.
Oh, these never work on the first try. All right, test. These turned on. Oh, turn them on.
Oh,
I think yours.
mine's on.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. Just get a little closer.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Perfect. Okay. Denise Hearn, welcome to the show. Welcome to the Local Maximum.
Thank you very much.
Isn't it great to be on this show that you probably never heard of? So yeah. So thanks for speaking to us today. Your book is called The Myth of Capitalism. Let's start with something that maybe should be basic here, but I imagine it's not so straightforward if you ask 20 people on the street. Last week on this program, I spoke to the admin of the Facebook capitalism page. Facebook's not treating it too well, by the way. My question here is, how do you define capitalism?
Okay, so we would basically have a very basic description of capitalism, which is that you need competition in the markets, you need a competitive marketplace, and that fosters innovation. And the whole title, The Myth of Capitalism, is so interesting. When I was last in New York, actually, some guy saw me carrying the book, and he came up to me and he said, "Myth of Capitalism, are you a socialist?" And then he started ranting against
Right. If I see the
AOC.
title, I'm not sure what I'm going to get.
Yeah, exactly. So then I explained the thesis. No, actually, we are trying to say that basically we right now associate the U.S. with as the bastion of free markets globally, but what we have seen in our research is that actually competition has been declining over the last 40 years, and so we don't actually live in a free market capitalist system currently. We live in a monopoly and oligopoly system, and so that's why it's the myth of capitalism.
So you've spoken about the trend of consolidation of industry and the lack of investment in competitive startups. Do you see this trend across the economic spectrum, or is it concentrated in certain industries? And what do you think is the primary cause? I know you spoke about that a little bit, but maybe you could speak more to that.
Yeah, so what we actually see is that it's quite pervasive across all industries. 75% of industries have become more concentrated in the last 20 years. Again, as I mentioned in my talk, it's everything from funeral services to eyeglasses to kidney dialysis to airlines to banking. So there really isn't one sector that is sort of oh, do I have to get closer?
A little loud.
Okay,
yeah.
sorry.
You're good. You're good.
There isn't one sector that is kind of exempt from this. I'm forgetting the second part of your question. Sorry.
Oh, what's your take on what the primary cause is, or are the causes different in different industries?
Oh yeah, I think the primary cause definitely goes back to the 1980s when President Reagan relaxed the merger guidelines and made it easier for companies to merge. Basically we, over the last 40 years, have really only been concerned about consumer pricing when it comes to evaluating mergers, and that has been detrimental because we've sort of ignored all of the other facets around concentrated power. The other thing is, with tech companies, they offer free products, so how do you evaluate them in an antitrust framework when the entire kind of zeitgeist currently is around consumer pricing?
That's interesting. Do you think it was, it's always interesting to me how free products has been, I mean, there was a book about that, free, a radical idea. I don't really remember what, I didn't read it, but maybe that was a mistake to I don't know, say that the new wave of the future is free product, because, in reality, there's no such thing.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, even Amazon and Facebook and Google, they've sort of been able to, I think, circumvent antitrust scrutiny because they have this focus on sort of free products, or Amazon's whole kind of reason for being is, improve the customer experience, but, and so we all benefit tremendously from that. But then if you're a worker or if you're a supplier, sometimes it doesn't work out so well for you. And we've seen, with the Elizabeth Warren proposal, I don't know how many of you have read that or interested in that, but what I think people fail to realize about Amazon specifically is that they operate a platform that is supposed to be a neutral e-commerce platform, but actually 55% of the goods that are sold on Amazon are actually Amazon products or Amazon branded goods or unbranded, so you may not realize that they're Amazon. And so if you're a supplier, you have zero choice but to really list your product on Amazon, because again, also 55% of all online product searches start on Amazon. But you're basically dependent on them. They now are the fundamental infrastructure on which commerce is done. And you're dependent on your competitor to do business. And so that's why they're in this compromised position. And that's why Elizabeth Warren and others are saying you need to divorce those two things. You shouldn't be able to operate a platform and then also compete on that platform, basically.
So you had a slide in there about how, and the business school slide, which I got to, which was how in order to turn a profit, you need to have some sort of market dominance. But I guess the question is, how do you tell the difference between the temporary monopoly produced on a free market that may last for a few years versus something more permanently entrenched along the lines of what you're concerned about in your book and your presentation? And I guess if I could think off the top of my head, like the temporary monopoly situation, which I think is good, is sort of what I try to do is how I think about it is, okay, I invent something new, it comes out, it works really well, and then competitors are like, holy crap, that's really good, how did you do that? And then it takes them 6 months to a year to copy me. Meanwhile, I'm onto something else. So it's temporary. But what you see going on is some kind of a permanent entrenchment. How do you tell the difference between those two? Because in 2000, we were told, Microsoft now has like a 20-year lock on internet browsing. That turned out to be, not quite true. So, how do you think about this?
Well, and in part with Microsoft, it was because they actually did face scrutiny from the regulators that, they weren't broken up, but they certainly were forced to kind of divest themselves from some of the anti-competitive behavior that they had been, operating on. And so I think I think these are great questions. There are some monopolies that are natural monopolies that we would think are fine. We used to use the example of airplane manufacturers. That has become a little more controversial recently. But there are some industries where it makes sense to have those economies of scale, and it's very difficult to have multiple players just because of the way the industry functions. But I would say that the UK takes kind of and the EU takes a very proactive approach where they are sort of like actively looking for anti-competitive behavior, and they are actively evaluating to see whether this dominance in the marketplace is something that has been acquired fairly and also is sort of healthy and not subject to becoming too entrenched. And then they do those evaluations, whereas basically we have a completely retroactive approach right now where we wait until the problem is really bad and then we figure out what we should try and do about it. And so I basically, I think the regulators just need to be much more proactive. But it's not an easy question.
Yeah, sure. So we live in, I think, very interesting times when it comes to monetary policy, of all things. I think the last 15 years, the basic assumptions behind monetary policy over the last 100 have been seriously challenged. We've had an unprecedented stretch of extremely low interest rates in the United States and other countries. We've seen proponents of cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, experimenting with entirely new systems that say, no, you know what? We're going to have a completely capped money supply. So what do you see as the effects of monetary policy in recent decades, such as low interest rates and quantitative easing, on the trends that you've been observing?
Yeah, certainly. So with quantitative easing, there's no question that has exacerbated inequality, because basically it sort of was in the same zeitgeist of the trickle-down economics, that if we just print a bunch of money, then that'll somehow sort of trickle down into society and will generate more prosperity. But actually, what it of course has done is just continue to kind of continue to concentrate wealth in the hands of existing shareholders. And so that has ultimately been a failure. The other thing that's really interesting is actually, and we cite this in our book, is there was a woman who was studying cartels, and she was looking at how and why they form, and what are the conditions under which they flourish. And actually, so she thought it was going to be all these various things, and actually the only thing that she found that was statistically significant was low interest rates. And the reason being because essentially, if you're in a high interest rate environment as a firm, you need to be able to you need your collusion to pay off more immediately. Whereas when you're in a low interest rate environment, you can be patient. You can afford to wait. You can follow your competitors' moves.
Did you say the name, or can you send me a link later?
I'll send you a link. I'm forgetting her name, but yeah. So I found that really compelling and interesting, that in some ways that may have also precipitated these dynamics of concentration, because once you get to the level where you only have a few key players in each industry, it is much easier for them to collude, even tacitly, or even to follow each other's price moves. So we see that a lot in different industries. Airlines is a great example of that.
Yeah, so I want to come back to the idea behind behind this, this event today, which is, reasons why people don't get wealthy. You mentioned shareholders getting a lot wealthier than employees, but a lot of regular people are shareholders. I mean, most people in here probably have shares of some sort or brokerage account. So is there some situation where even, is there something rigged with the shareholding itself, where maybe the average person doesn't have access to the same investments as someone else would?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, what is kind of shocking when I was researching is that
I'm a shareholder. Why are I rich? Come on.
Yeah, well, and also actually, I think it's less than 50% of Americans actually own stock directly. And not just directly, but even through another vehicle like a pension, fund or something like that. And so actually there's a significant amount of people that don't actually participate in markets whatsoever, and so they're not getting the gains. And then, the other interesting thing that we talk about in the book is something called horizontal shareholding, where, so Warren Buffett is a great example, where it means that you own stock in all of the major players within one industry. So he used to say that he would never touch airlines with a 10-foot pole. He's like, this is a horrible investment, staying away, death trap, quote unquote. And yet now Berkshire Hathaway, his investment firm, is the first, second, or third primary shareholder in all 4 of the American major airlines. And so you have to ask yourself, well, why did that shift so dramatically?
And he just invested all of them at the same time?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, essentially. And basically it's because, now that they've consolidated and they have that market dominance, he thinks it's a great investment, and so he's plowed his money in. But the piece about horizontal shareholding that's interesting too is that there's now some evidence to suggest that also de-incentivizes competition, because if you're American Airlines and you know that your primary shareholders also own all your competitors, you don't want to go and actually compete with them and steal market share from them. You're basically incentivized to just make sure that the industry does well. So that's why you're going to raise fees, and you're going to do capacity discipline and provide fewer flights on major routes so that you can jack the airline prices up and things like that. So so there's ways with the rise of passive investing that this has also kind of exacerbated those dynamics.
So I think that a lot of the reasons why people don't get wealthy that were given, some of them are stuff that's kind of outside of your control, like where you're born, your upbringing, that kind of thing. But there are some things that are within a person's control. Do you learn from your mistakes? Do you take risks where appropriate? Do you plan for the future? We just spoke about this in this group. So I still believe in the idea that there is something that you can do, even in a rigged system, to work for a better future. So do you have anything to say about what people can do on an individual level to improve their wealth, or even just their well-being in this type of economy? In other words, despite the problems that you point out.
Yes, certainly. So I think though, of course, our book is sort of claiming that it's much harder and that there are many hidden forces working against people in this regard. I think things like probably not ballooning, credit and debt is one thing. I'm Canadian, and Canada is like second in the world for personal debt and private debt.
Who's first? Is that us?
China.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, those are. I just think there's a lot of financial illiteracy. I didn't really know anything. I couldn't have told you what a bond was like 4 years ago. Look at me now. I know, right? So it is amazing, what you can learn. But I think that I think that is a failure of the education system, probably, to help people really understand the dynamics of sort of personal financing, and there's also the poverty premium, where those who don't have means end up paying higher interest rates to access financing, and that is just a real issue. So there's all kinds of things, but I think that, I don't know, that might be one area we could improve on.
Yep. All right. So now it's been about 15 minutes, so we're just about ready to wrap it up. Do you have any closing thoughts about anything that we just said in the show or this event? And also, tell my podcast listeners where they can find out more about you and your book.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is where you get to plug yourself.
Oh, my favorite thing. So mythofcapitalism.com, if anyone wants to follow our work. We have a newsletter. And unfortunately, you can purchase the book on Amazon. But I would prefer if you did it from your local bookstore. This has been fantastic. Thank you again, everyone, for coming out, and Max for hosting me. Appreciate it.
Denise, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.